Philadelphia, a city built on loyalty, power, and pride. But hidden beneath its streets lies a darker empire, one ruled by a man who refused to let the mafia die. His name was Joseph "Skinny Joey" Merlino, a charming, fearless, and unpredictable gangster who brought the Philadelphia mob back from the grave. While the old dons faded into history, Joey became the face of a new generation, bold enough to stand in front of cameras, daring enough to challenge the FBI, and smart enough to rebuild an empire in plain sight. He wasn't your typical mafia boss. He laughed at danger, lived like a celebrity, and treated every headline as a badge of honor. The cops called him a criminal mastermind. The media called him the John Gotti of Philly. But his enemies called him something else: unstoppable. This is not just the story of a gangster. It's the legend of a man who refused to fade away with the old mafia, a man who lived, fought, and survived by his own code. This is the real-life story of Skinny Joey Merlino, the Don who wouldn't die with the mafia. In the early 1990s, when most of America's mafia families were falling apart, one man was making the headlines for all the right and wrong reasons. His name was Joey "Skinny Joey" Merlino, a street-smart kid from South Philadelphia with the blood of a mobster and the ambition of a king. While the legendary New York families were fading under FBI pressure, Joey was bringing the mafia back to life, his way. He wasn't afraid of the cameras, he wasn't afraid of the law, and he certainly wasn't afraid of the old bosses who said the glory days were over. Joey's rise wasn't just about crime. It was about image, charisma, and control. He wore designer suits, drove luxury cars, and smiled for reporters outside courtrooms. To the media, he was the John Gotti of Philly, flashy, confident, and dangerously likable. To his crew, he was a leader who made them believe that the old mafia still had power. But to the FBI, he was a ticking time bomb, unpredictable, untouchable, and always one step ahead. As the streets of Philadelphia erupted with power struggles and bloodshed, Joey Merlino stood in the center of it all, a man fighting not just for control, but for legacy. His story isn't just about money or murder, it's about pride, loyalty, and survival in a world where one mistake can mean death. This is how Skinny Joey Merlino became the last real Don of Philadelphia, and why his name still echoes through the underworld today. Joey Merlino's story begins in the heart of South Philadelphia, a neighborhood where the streets were ruled by respect, silence, and family loyalty. Born in 1962, he was raised in a world where crime and power weren't just whispered about. They were part of daily life. His father, Salvatore "Chucky" Merlino, was a powerful underboss in the Bruno crime family, one of the most respected mafia organizations on the East Coast. For Joey, power was something he understood from the start. It wasn't given, it was taken. But the Merlino name came with both privilege and pressure. When his father was convicted and sent to prison, Joey suddenly found himself without the protection of the family legacy. Instead of stepping back, he decided to make his own mark. By the late 1980s, Joey had built a reputation as a fearless street enforcer, someone who wouldn't hesitate to fight for control. He gathered around him a group of young, ambitious men who were tired of taking orders from the old bosses. They called themselves the Young Turks. Their mission was simple but dangerous: to bring the Philadelphia mob back to its former glory, even if it meant going to war to do it. Joey's crew operated differently. They were modern, media-savvy, and reckless. While the traditional mafia stayed in the shadows, Joey embraced the spotlight. He went out to nightclubs, posed for photos, and talked openly to reporters. It wasn't the mafia way, but it worked. People began to fear and admire him in equal measure. He was seen as the man bringing style back to organized crime, the kind of gangster who dressed sharp, spoke smooth, and made the mob look powerful again. But beneath that charm was a ruthless leader. Joey's crew was involved in loan sharking, bookmaking, extortion, and drug distribution. They collected debts with intimidation, controlled illegal gambling rings, and demanded respect from every corner of South Philly. Rival groups soon realized that Joey wasn't playing by the old rules. He was rewriting them. And that made him dangerous. His rise to power wasn't without bloodshed. One of his biggest rivals was John Stanfa, a Sicilian-born boss who represented the old-school way of running the mafia. Quiet, conservative, and secretive. Stanfa saw Joey as a loud, reckless outsider who needed to be silenced. But Joey saw Stanfa as weak, out of touch, and unworthy of leading the family his father once helped build. Tensions quickly turned violent. Drive-by shootings, attempted hits, and street ambushes became common. South Philadelphia became a war zone. The FBI later described this period as one of the bloodiest internal mafia battles in American history. Yet through all the chaos, Joey remained calm and confident. He attended social events, smiled for cameras, and made it seem as though the war didn't bother him at all. What made Joey different was his fearlessness. He wasn't just fighting for money or power. He was fighting to prove that the mafia still mattered. He believed the old generation had lost its spark, and that only someone like him could restore the honor and excitement that once defined the underworld. By the early 1990s, his influence was undeniable. Street corners that once belonged to rival factions now reported to him. His crew's loyalty was unmatched. They would do anything for Joey, not out of fear, but out of respect. To them, he wasn't just a boss. He was a symbol of defiance. In a time when the mafia across America was crumbling under FBI pressure and betrayals, skinny Joey Merlino stood as a reminder of what the life once meant. He wasn't afraid of the law, the press, or even death. For Joey, being a gangster wasn't just about crime. It was about legacy. And with every move he made, every risk he took, he was writing his own chapter in the long, bloody history of the Philadelphia mob. He wasn't done yet. The city would soon learn just how far Joey Merlino was willing to go to become the real Don of Philadelphia. The war for control of Philadelphia's underworld would soon turn into one of the bloodiest internal conflicts in mafia history. By the early 1990s, Joey Merlino and his Young Turks were no longer just a rebellious crew. They were at open war with the old Sicilian faction led by John Stanfa. What began as whispered threats and subtle power plays quickly exploded into a violent street war that would leave a trail of blood across South Philly. Stanfa represented the old ways: quiet business, total secrecy, and ruthless discipline. He believed Joey's flashiness and public appearances were reckless, even suicidal for the mafia's survival. But Joey didn't care about tradition. He believed the mafia had become weak and needed to be feared again. He mocked the old-school rules, saying the streets respected action, not silence. Soon, both sides were hunting each other. Drive-by shootings became part of daily life. One morning, Joey barely survived an ambush when gunmen opened fire on his car. A few months later, Stanfa's men were attacked at a red light, bullets ripping through their windshield. The city turned into a war zone. The media called it the Philadelphia Mob War, and Joey's name was on every front page. The FBI began tailing both sides, recording phone calls and tracking financial movements. But Joey didn't hide. While others went underground, he appeared at clubs, smiled for cameras, and acted as though nothing could touch him. His calm confidence made him look untouchable, and his legend grew. To the younger generation, Joey became a symbol of rebellion, the new Don who lived without fear. Stanfa tried to restore order by demanding loyalty from old members, but his empire was collapsing. Too many of his soldiers respected Joey. They saw in him what they'd been missing for years: leadership with fire. When Stanfa was finally arrested on racketeering and murder charges, it was the final blow. His reign was over. Joey Merlino had won the war. The Merlino faction officially took control of Philadelphia's organized crime network. For the first time in years, the city's mob had a leader who wasn't hiding, someone who enjoyed being the center of attention. Joey became the public face of the mafia, smiling for photographers outside courtrooms, giving reporters quotes, and living like a celebrity. He threw charity events for sick children, held public parties, and told everyone he'd gone legitimate. But the FBI wasn't convinced. They knew Joey's charm was a mask. Behind the expensive suits and public image was a ruthless businessman running an empire of gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. Federal agents began collecting evidence, listening to wiretaps and flipping insiders. Still, Joey kept playing his game. He openly denied being a mob boss, calling himself just a guy from the neighborhood. To some, it looked like arrogance. To others, it was genius. He had found a way to control the city while pretending to live clean. But power always attracts danger, from both enemies and the law. With every camera flash and every headline, Joey drew more attention than ever before. The old mafia had survived for decades by hiding in the shadows. Joey was shining a spotlight on it, and that would soon come back to haunt him. The war had made him a king, but the peace that followed would test whether he could keep his crown. Because when you're the Don of Philadelphia, there's only one way to stay on top. You have to outsmart everyone, including the FBI. And soon, they were coming for skinny Joey Merlino. By 1999, the FBI had gathered enough evidence to bring down Joey Merlino and his entire organization. For years, agents had tracked his movements, recorded his conversations, and flipped some of his closest associates. They had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and that moment finally came. Federal agents raided homes across Philadelphia, arresting Joey and several of his top men on charges of racketeering, gambling, extortion, and attempted murder. The news exploded across national headlines. Reporters crowded outside the courthouse as Joey was led in, wearing a sharp suit and flashing his trademark grin. He looked more like a movie star than a man facing decades in prison. The media called him the John Gotti of Philadelphia, the last flashy Don who refused to hide. Joey played into it, cracking jokes with journalists and charming everyone in the courtroom. But behind the charm was a man fighting for his life. The trial that followed was one of the most publicized mafia cases of its time. Prosecutors painted Joey as a violent gangster who ran Philadelphia's underworld through fear and loyalty. They brought in tapes, witnesses, and even former associates who had turned informants. Joey's defense was simple. He denied being a mafia boss. He claimed he was just a gambler, a family man, and a victim of FBI obsession. Despite his charisma, the evidence was strong. The jury convicted him of racketeering and other organized crime-related charges. In 2001, Joey Merlino was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. For many, that was the end of his reign. The FBI declared victory, saying Philadelphia's mafia was finally dead. But Joey didn't see it that way. Behind bars, he remained calm, collected, and unbroken. He spent his years in prison reading, working out, and refusing to cooperate with the government. Unlike many mobsters of his era, Joey never turned informant. He didn't cut deals, didn't name names, and didn't betray his code. For that, he earned respect, even from rival families. In a world where loyalty was disappearing, Joey held on to the one thing that made him stand out: silence. Even in prison, his legend grew. Magazines wrote stories about his charisma and his defiance. Rumors spread that he still controlled parts of the Philly mob from behind bars. Whether true or not, the myth kept his name alive. When he finally walked out of prison in 2011, reporters were waiting. Joey looked thinner, older, but still sharp, still skinny Joey. But the world he was returning to had changed. The mafia wasn't what it used to be. The old families had been crushed, the codes of honor shattered, and the streets ruled by new kinds of criminals. Still, Joey wasn't done. He told reporters he was retired, that he'd moved on from the life, but few believed him. For Joey Merlino, the prison years didn't break his spirit. They made him smarter, calmer, and more careful. He had learned that survival wasn't about staying in power. It was about adapting. The mafia may have been dying, but Joey wasn't going down with it. He had plans. And the world was about to see that the dawn of Philadelphia wasn't finished yet. When Joey Merlino walked out of federal prison in 2011, many thought he'd vanish quietly into obscurity like most aging mobsters. But Joey was never built for the shadows. Within months, he was back in the headlines. Not for violence or extortion this time, but for opening a restaurant. In Boca Raton, Florida, he launched Merlino's, an upscale Italian eatery where Joey himself would greet guests, pose for photos, and tell stories from his old life. The place became a hit. Celebrities, ex-cops, and even curious journalists wanted a glimpse of the man who once ruled the Philadelphia underworld. But behind the charm and smiles, federal agents were watching closely. They believed Joey's restaurant was more than a business. They thought it was a cover for a new operation. The FBI alleged that Joey had quietly reconnected with East Coast associates, running an illegal sports betting and loan sharking ring that stretched from Philadelphia to Florida. In 2016, the feds moved again. Joey and more than 40 alleged mob figures were indicted in a massive racketeering case. This time, the government claimed Joey was still a major player, working with members of the Genovese and Gambino families in a multi-state criminal network. But when the case went to trial, something unexpected happened. The evidence wasn't strong enough to bring him down. The star witness, an informant named John Rubio, had credibility issues, and Joey's defense team shredded the prosecution's case. The jury found him not guilty of all major racketeering charges, convicting him only of a minor gambling offense. Joey walked out of court smiling again, a free man. Reporters swarmed him outside, asking if he was still a mob boss. Joey just laughed and said, "I'm retired. I gamble, that's all." For most men, prison would have been the end. For Joey, it was a reboot. He'd become older, wiser, and more media savvy. He knew how to play the system, giving the public just enough to keep his legend alive, but never enough to send him back for good. He gave interviews, appeared at social events, and lived comfortably in Florida, often spotted at horse tracks or on the beach, still tanned, still confident. To his followers, Joey Merlino was a symbol of loyalty and defiance, the last man standing from a dying world. He'd gone to war, gone to prison, and faced the FBI twice. And yet, he was still walking free. To his critics, he was a relic, a man clinging to an outdated code in a world that had moved on. But Joey didn't care about what people thought. He'd already outlived most of his enemies and outsmarted the government more than once. He knew that survival was the ultimate victory. Whether he was running rackets or serving pasta, one thing was certain. Skinny Joey Merlino had proven that you can't kill the spirit of a true Don. Even after decades of arrests, betrayals, and investigations, Joey's name still carried power, a reminder that the mafia might fade, but never die. And for Joey, that was enough. He didn't need a throne anymore. His legacy was already written, in blood, loyalty, and the streets of Philadelphia. Today, Skinny Joey Merlino lives a quieter life, or at least, that's what it looks like from the outside. No longer the flashy young Don commanding soldiers on the streets of Philadelphia, Joey now spends most of his days in Florida, keeping a low profile, enjoying the sunshine, and watching the world he once ruled fade into history. But to those who know the life, his name still carries weight, a name that symbolizes the last breath of the old mafia. Joey isn't just remembered for his crimes, he's remembered for his defiance. He was the rare mobster who smiled for the cameras, taunted the FBI, and lived openly when everyone else hid. He survived mob wars, murder plots, and federal indictments. And through it all, he never turned informant, never begged for mercy, and never betrayed his code. In a world where loyalty had become a myth, Joey Merlino remained loyal to the end. But legends come with shadows. Some say Joey still has quiet influence in Philadelphia's underworld. Not through orders or violence, but through respect. Even retired, his name still commands fear and admiration. Younger gangsters look up to him as the last real boss, the man who kept the mafia alive long after everyone else gave up. To law enforcement, he remains a symbol of unfinished business. To the streets, he's the Don who made the mafia matter again. Joey's life is a paradox. Part crime story, part comeback tale, part myth. He's a man who lost everything and still walked away undefeated. His legacy is not just about the mob, but about survival, about refusing to die when the world wants you forgotten. In the end, Skinny Joey Merlino became more than a gangster. He became a legend, a reminder of an era where loyalty meant everything and betrayal meant death. The mafia may never return to its former power, but Joey's story proves that its spirit still lingers. He is the last real Don, the man who refused to fade away with the old mafia, and who, against all odds, kept its flame burning long after the rest of the underworld turned to ash.